This was the beginning of BP's nightmare, a deadly explosion on a deepwater rig in the Gulf of Mexico. It sent tons of oil pumping into the waters off the US coast and marked the beginning of what would become the worst environmental disaster in US history. In the months that followed, BP funded an increasingly desperate effort to plug the hole and clean up the mess. But scenes like these made BP a target for US politicians and turned its CEO into a hate figure. The US government says nearly 5 million barrels of oil gushed into the Gulf before the broken well was finally capped. Now, BP disputes that number, but either way, the slicks have disappeared, but the fallout continues. And the US government is suing the oil giant and a string of other companies connected to the disaster. So how badly did the spill damage BP's brand and, of course, its bottom line? Well, joining me here is CNN's Jim Bolden, who covered the disaster throughout. Jim, let's start with that first question. How serious was the damage to BP at the bottom line, or will it be?
Well, we can't say how much it will be because we're still trying to find that out. I mean, obviously, we have another many years to go because BP is only being sued so far by the U.S. government for civil charges, and we don't know what that number will be because until they actually resolve how many barrels of oil actually went into the Gulf, because that's the way the law is. And we haven't seen any criminal charges yet, and BP gets it in the neck both ways because it could be sued by some of its shareholders because BP suspended its dividends. So it's got those issues to face as well. It could have many years of fines to come. Above all that, of course, BP says it should cost it around $40 billion. Now, that was the number we heard a couple months ago. That could change.
That is a staggering figure,
yes,
even in the context of an enormous company like BP. But what about the damage to the BP brand?
It depends on how you look at it. Obviously, the brand was in tatters in the U.S., there's no doubt. The attacks by the White House and U.S. Congress damaged BP and its then CEO, Tony Hayward, beyond repair. And if you remember, some of the statements he made didn't help any. And let's hear one of those statements from Tony Hayward.
We're sorry. We're sorry for the massive disruption it's caused to their lives. And, you know, there's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. You know, I'd like my life back.
But, of course, then Tony Hayward was pushed out, and an American, Bob Dudley, took over. And the temperature changed completely with then. We've learned since then that BP was having real trouble getting money from its banks. Its day-to-day funding was seriously in trouble. And Bob Dudley and the chairman and the CEO all went to the White House and said, look, basically, do you want a company that's going to survive to help clean up the cost? Because the heat was so strong that it was getting much worse than we thought, because BP has plenty of money and had plenty of very good assets that were continuing to perform. But the day-to-day operations were in trouble. So the White House backed off a bit. Congress did back off a bit. Not the suits and things, but so the reputation's starting to be rebuilt. Also, as far as other oil companies, of course, they're very upset at BP because they did this, and you know they feel that they're damaged.
Absolutely, but let's just chart this. You know, clearly there's the financial disaster, there's the reputational damage, because this was really a PR disaster. I mean, that soundbite that we listened to from Tony Hayward was absolutely damning. His career was really over from the moment that went out. I mean, let's be absolutely clear about that and not beat about the bush. Clearly there's this huge environmental disaster, and also the disaster in terms of the PR for the whole of the industry. I mean, let's look at the cleanup. Presumably, you know, it will take a long time to get that coastline really clean, won't it?
It's interesting, though, because in the last few months, people have started to say, where did all the oil go? Because they did soak up a fair amount of it during the time. Obviously, the well was capped. And now there's questions about how much more cleanup will there have to be, and is there a large plume of oil under the water somewhere that hasn't been found yet? So you never know how far that might go. Of course, there's still technically a moratorium on new deepwater drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, which is annoying the other oil companies as well. It depends on how you read it. You could argue that maybe the moratorium is being lifted, but the rules are so difficult that a lot of companies won't do it.
So, in effect, the oil companies feel that they've suffered because BP goofed, to want of a better word.
And what's interesting, though, is that the last quarterly results that Bob Dudley did hold for BP, he said he didn't see any damage for BP in the rest of the world. He didn't find any governments, particularly, who didn't want to work with BP because of what happened in the Gulf. So in that sense, the brand hasn't been permanently damaged, at least in their eyes at the moment.
Jim Bolden, thank you very much indeed.